Winston Churchill is celebrated as the undisputed savior of the free world. But what if I told you that behind closed doors, he orchestrated a betrayal so cold-blooded it almost destroyed an entire Allied nation? What the mainstream history books refuse to tell you is how the British Empire deliberately used the bodies of tens of thousands of young, brave men to cover up their own catastrophic military blunders. We are talking about loyal soldiers who crossed oceans to fight for the crown, only to be treated as cheap, disposable cannon fodder by arrogant generals. Generals who cared more about the shine of their boots than the lives of their men. 0 seconds / greater than why were elite troops intentionally left behind on doomed islands to face German tanks with no radio, no transport, and absolutely no hope? What was inside the top-secret explosive telegram that sparked the most vicious, untold political showdown of the Second World War? And why did British High Command try so desperately to bury the truth about the men they laughed at and called useless colonial rabble? Today, we are ripping the lid off the darkest, most heavily censored scandal in the history of the British Imperial Command. We are going to expose the shocking backroom deals, the arrogant cover-ups, and the ultimate act of betrayal that shattered an empire's illusion forever. Trust me, you need to watch this video right to the very end, because when I reveal what Churchill secretly tried to do while an enemy invasion fleet was literally on the horizon, your blood will absolutely boil. Buckle up, hit that like button, and let's dive into the explosive truth they tried to erase from history. The catastrophic blunder began unfolding in the spring of 1941 when British Imperial commanders made a decision so fundamentally flawed that it borders on absolute treason against their own Allied forces. Winston Churchill, sitting safely in his London office, ordered a staggering 62,000 Allied troops to deploy directly into the mountainous, unforgiving terrain of Greece to halt an unstoppable German armored juggernaut. Among these incredibly brave but doomed formations were 16,000 Australian soldiers from the 6th and 7th Divisions, men who were treated as completely expendable assets on a geopolitical chessboard. The strategic logic behind this disastrous deployment was practically non-existent, as German panzer divisions had already proven their overwhelming destructive capabilities across the bleeding fields of France. British intelligence had completely underestimated the terrifying speed and crushing weight of the incoming mechanized assault, sending these young men into an absolute military meat grinder. Senior British military officials operating in the Mediterranean theater knew perfectly well that this expedition was doomed from the very moment the official orders were hastily signed. The Greek landscape offered nothing but treacherous mountain passes and ruined roads, while Allied air cover was virtually a mythical concept that existed only in the delusional fantasies of high command. Despite possessing clear knowledge that the campaign would end in utter catastrophe, the generals dispatched the Australian forces anyway, forcing them to face the elite troops of General Erich von Manstein. It was a spectacular display of imperial arrogance, prioritizing a pointless political gesture over the preservation of thousands of healthy, highly capable young lives. The commanders simply expected the colonial troops to absorb the horrific shock of the German war machine, while the masterminds of this disaster remained comfortably behind heavily fortified lines. But the nightmare in the rugged hills of Greece was merely the opening act of a much larger, darker tragedy that would soon shock the entire world. The entire Greek campaign collapsed in less than 3 agonizing weeks, exactly as the most cynical observers had privately predicted before a single shot was ever fired. German armored columns punched through the thinly stretched and poorly supplied Allied defensive lines with an almost mechanical, terrifying ease that left the British strategists completely paralyzed. The supposed organized withdrawal instantly devolved into a chaotic, desperate rout, leaving the frontline units completely isolated and frantically scrambling for any possible means of escape. Australian battalions received the grim orders to hold their ground until the very last possible moment, explicitly instructed to cover the frantic retreat of British formations that had already abandoned their critical posts. These courageous rearguard actions rank among the most intensely brutal and punishing episodes in modern military history, showcasing incredible valor in the face of absolute, unforgivable abandonment. Soldiers who had spent years rigorously training and had crossed entire oceans to defend the empire suddenly found themselves utterly forsaken on completely surrounded hillsides. They possessed absolutely no reliable transport, desperately lacked essential air support, and received contradictory orders from headquarters that completely defied basic tactical sanity. When the heavy dust finally settled over the shattered Greek countryside, more than 5,000 heavily armed Australian soldiers had been forced into humiliating captivity. They were marched away to endure years of unimaginable suffering behind barbed wire, utterly betrayed by the very leaders who had sworn to guide them to ultimate victory. And the staggering scale of this preventable loss sent massive shockwaves through the political corridors of Canberra, severely fracturing the foundational trust between the Dominion and the Empire. Yet, the sheer incompetence of the imperial command structure was about to reach even more devastating depths on a supposedly secure Mediterranean island. Thousands of the exhausted, deeply traumatized survivors from the Greek debacle were hurriedly evacuated across the water to the island of Crete, where the unbelievable catastrophe simply continued without a single moment of hesitation. British authorities boldly presented the island to the global public as a highly defensible fortress. But the reality on the ground was a scandalous, entirely disorganized mess. The garrison station there was critically undersupplied, physically drained, and suffered under a command structure so hopelessly confused that no single officer actually exercised effective control over the broader defensive strategy. The defenders lacked heavy artillery, adequate ammunition, and even basic medical supplies to treat the inevitable casualties that a major military engagement would rapidly produce. It was the perfect recipe for a total disaster, engineered entirely by the astonishing negligence of the top brass, who absolutely refused to learn from their previous catastrophic mistakes. When the sky darkened with German paratroopers on the 20th of May, 1941, the ensuing struggle instantly devolved into desperate, savage hand-to-hand combat among the ancient olive groves. Australian troops belonging to the 19th Brigade fought with such an astonishing level of ferocity that they completely shocked the highly decorated, battle-hardened German airborne veterans. Around the strategically vital village of Rethymno, Australian forces commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ian Campbell held their battered positions for an unbelievable 11 consecutive days. They maintained their fierce resistance long after the official evacuation of the island had already commenced, purely because absolutely nobody from Central Command bothered to inform them that the battle was officially lost. These magnificent fighters possess absolutely no functioning radio contact with higher headquarters, leaving them entirely blind to the horrifying fact that they had been deliberately sacrificed. The final evacuation from the shores of Crete was a thoroughly chaotic, horribly mismanaged affair that perfectly mirrored the shameful indifference of the earlier Greek withdrawal. When the last Royal Navy vessels pulled away from the smoky beaches and vanished into the darkness, they left behind more than 3,000 bewildered Australian soldiers. These men were instantly transformed into miserable prisoners of war, condemned to spend the remainder of the global conflict wasting away in freezing, disease-ridden internment camps across Europe. The sheer scale of this abandonment remains one of the most heavily censored and uncomfortable truths of the entire Mediterranean theater, actively suppressed by aggressive wartime propaganda. It was a blatant betrayal of the most basic military covenant, conclusively proving that colonial troops were entirely expendable when British shipping capacity reached its absolute limit. The ultimate insult, however, was not the loss of the island itself, but the absolutely disgusting manner in which the architects of this ruin were publicly celebrated. General Bernard Freyberg, the British commander who was ultimately responsible for the breathtakingly mismanaged defense of Crete, faced absolutely no professional consequences for losing thousands of Allied troops. Instead of facing a rigorous court-martial for his staggering tactical failures, the imperial establishment decided to lavish him with the absolute highest honors the crown could bestow upon a citizen. Having already secured the Victoria Cross during a previous conflict, he was cheerfully awarded a prestigious knighthood for his supposedly valiant efforts during the spectacular Cretan disaster. While the general celebrated his shiny new aristocratic title in highly comfortable surroundings, The thousands of Australians he abandoned on the beaches received nothing but cheap wooden crosses. The sickening juxtaposition of British aristocratic reward against Australian tragedy permanently shattered the illusion of a unified equal partnership within the glorious ranks of the empire. While the catastrophic blunders in the northern Mediterranean were busy filling the prisoner camps with betrayed soldiers, a remarkably different narrative was violently erupting across the scorching sands of North Africa. The mighty 9th Australian Division, operating under the fiercely uncompromising command of Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead, received the monumental task of defending a dusty, severely battered coastal town in Libya. This isolated port settlement, known to the world as Tobruk, rapidly transformed into the most strategically vital piece of real estate in the entire Middle East theater. It stood as the only major obstacle preventing the Axis forces from sweeping directly across the desert and capturing the glittering prize of Cairo and the crucial Suez Canal. Here, far away from the meddling incompetence of the London politicians, the highly motivated Australian forces were about to fundamentally rewrite the established rules of modern desert warfare. What happened next in that blistering, fly-infested wasteland would permanently cement their legendary status and completely humiliate the greatest tactical mind of the opposing forces. The brilliant and fiercely aggressive German commander, General Erwin Rommel, had been slicing through the desert with his legendary Afrika Korps, utterly devastating the bewildered British formations standing in his path. Bursting with supreme confidence and backed by a seemingly invincible armored spearhead, Rommel confidently boasted to his superiors that the miserable fortifications of Tobruk would crumble in a matter of hours. His elite staff officers casually estimated that the Allied perimeter would be completely overrun within 48 hours of the very first serious mechanized assault on the defensive lines. They viewed the colonial defenders as little more than an irritating speed bump on their glorious, unstoppable march toward ultimate victory in the Middle East. The arrogant German command structure fundamentally failed to realize that they were no longer dealing with the heavily bureaucratic, hopelessly slow-moving British divisions they had previously crushed with ease. Instead of a rapid capitulation, the entire watching world witnessed the commencement of a brutal, grueling siege that would drag on for an unbelievable 242 days. From April right through to November of 1941, Tobruk endured the absolutely longest, unbroken siege faced by any Allied garrison during the entire global conflict. Rommel angrily threw wave after devastating wave of heavy armor and elite infantry directly at the crumbling perimeter, determined to permanently break the spirit of the stubborn defenders. Yet, against all conventional military logic, General Morshead and his incredibly resilient troops held their shattered ground with an iron will that absolutely baffled the furious attackers. They established a rigid, uncompromising doctrine of aggressive defense, completely refusing to yield a single inch of the scorched earth without extracting an unimaginably heavy toll from the invading enemy. The physical conditions inside the besieged perimeter were so spectacularly horrific that simply surviving the extreme environment required a monumental effort of human endurance and sheer willpower. The Australian troops held their vital positions using wildly improvised weaponry, constantly forced to scavenge for desperately needed ammunition amid the smoking, ruined buildings of the shattered port town. They maintained their heavily bombarded posts while suffering through blinding sandstorms, brutal heat stroke, rampant dysentery, and a chronic, maddening shortage of absolutely every basic supply necessary for daily survival. The burning sky above them offered absolutely no relief, constantly filled with the terrifying scream of enemy dive bombers delivering an unrelenting payload of high explosives directly onto their shallow trenches. Meanwhile, the British headquarters back in Cairo continuously debated what to do, changing their strategic minds repeatedly while the brave men in the desert actually shed their blood. But the men of the 9th Division did not simply cower in their dirty trenches waiting for salvation. They aggressively took the fight directly into the terrifying darkness of the desert. As soon as the scorching sun dipped below the horizon, The fiercely determined Australian soldiers transformed the featureless desert into their own personal, highly lethal hunting ground. Small, heavily armed patrols would slip silently through the densely mined perimeter wire, creeping miles behind the enemy lines to unleash absolute havoc on the resting German encampments. They executed these daring night raids with such terrifying precision and breathtaking ruthlessness that the previously unstoppable soldiers of the Afrika Korps quickly developed a deep psychological dread of the darkness. These stealthy, highly coordinated operations systematically dismantled enemy supply depots, eliminated forward observation posts, and captured vital intelligence right from under the noses of the furious Axis commanders. The colonial troops, previously dismissed by British generals as highly undisciplined rabble, were currently operating as the most lethally effective asymmetrical fighting force on the entire African continent. The continuous nerve-shredding pressure of these violent nocturnal assaults eventually forced General Rommel to fundamentally alter his official communications regarding the incredibly stubborn defenders. He completely stopped referring to them as mere colonial irregulars who could be casually brushed aside, officially recognizing them as a highly serious, incredibly dangerous military organization that commanded genuine respect. Frustrated by the massive disruptions to their crucial supply lines and deeply unnerved by the constant night terrors, the exhausted German propaganda machine desperately tried to publicly insult the defenders. A prominent German radio broadcaster sneeringly declared that the Australians were caught like rats in a trap, living miserably in deep, filthy holes under the burning desert surface. It was intended to be a devastating psychological insult, heavily designed to completely break the fading morale of the exhausted men defending the continuously battered perimeter. In a brilliant, entirely unexpected stroke of psychological defiance, the incredibly stubborn defenders instantly embraced the intended insult and proudly adopted it as their official legendary moniker. They openly declared themselves the Rats of Tobruk, even going so far as to craft unauthorized, highly prized medals out of scavenged scrap metal from downed enemy aircraft to celebrate their new title. This iconic nickname did not originate from some pompous British general handing down unearned praise from a highly comfortable leather chair in a perfectly secure London office building. It was fiercely forged in the absolute crucible of intense frontline combat, heavily endorsed by the immense frustration of a brilliant German commander who was publicly forced to admit he had been halted. They wore the gritty title as a magnificent badge of honor, proving to the entire Allied world that a determined group of colonial soldiers could successfully halt the terrifying blitzkrieg. The sheer audacity of the Australian defensive network completely rewrote the complex tactical manuals that the British military establishment had blindly and foolishly followed for decades. General Morshead possessed an absolute unwavering belief that passive defense was merely a prolonged invitation to utter ruin, demanding that his men constantly maintain the aggressive offensive initiative. His brilliantly aggressive strategy transformed the heavily besieged enclave into a violently active fortress, a sprawling labyrinth of heavily fortified strongpoints that operated as a massive, incredibly lethal trap. German armored units that managed to breach the outer perimeter were deliberately allowed to advance, only to be completely annihilated by hidden anti-tank batteries perfectly positioned in the devastating crossfire. It was an absolute masterclass in modern defensive warfare, executed flawlessly by brave men who had been entirely written off by the highly aristocratic officers of the Imperial High Command. While the resilient diggers were busy performing absolute military miracles in the choking dust of the Libyan desert, the astonishing hypocrisy of the British command in Cairo became undeniably glaring. High-ranking staff officers wearing immaculate uniforms and sporting perfectly polished boots spent their days lounging in luxurious colonial hotels, casually debating the fate of the Tobruk garrison over crystal glasses of expensive gin. They frantically drafted countless contradictory memorandums, completely failing to provide any genuinely meaningful logistical support or coherent strategic direction to the men actually suffering on the brutal front lines. The massive cultural chasm between the pragmatic, highly hardened frontline fighters and the fiercely arrogant, hopelessly detached imperial planners widened into an absolute, totally unbridgeable canyon of mutual contempt. The astonishing victories achieved in the blistering heat were won completely in spite of the British command structure, rather than because of their supposed strategic brilliance and superior planning. This unbelievable display of battlefield supremacy by the fiercely independent colonial troops should have permanently silenced the sneering critics roaming the prestigious halls of the British War Office. The irrefutable proof of their incredible combat effectiveness was literally written in the burning wreckage of German panzers heavily littering the desolate landscape surrounding the fiercely contested port city. However, the deeply entrenched imperial mindset was incredibly resistant to acknowledging the undeniable brilliance of forces they traditionally considered socially and culturally inferior to their own distinguished ranks. The spectacular triumph in North Africa was tragically overshadowed by the devastating betrayals that were rapidly approaching on the deeply dark and heavily ominous geopolitical horizon. The political masters in London were already quietly preparing to sacrifice thousands more of these magnificent fighters, perfectly setting the grand stage for the most explosive and scandalous confrontation in the history of the entire alliance. The most spectacular and humiliating military capitulation in the entire recorded history of the British Empire exploded into reality in February 1942. The supposedly impenetrable fortress of Singapore, heavily promoted by London as the ultimate invincible bastion of colonial power, collapsed like a remarkably cheap house of cards. British General Arthur Percival orchestrated an absolutely unforgivable tactical disaster, surrendering a massive, heavily armed garrison to a Japanese force that was vastly inferior in numbers and rolling through the dense jungle on ordinary stolen bicycles. More than 80,000 Allied troops were disgracefully handed over to the advancing enemy, completely abandoning the defense of the crucial Pacific region. It was a staggering, deeply shameful display of aristocratic incompetence that permanently shattered the fragile, carefully constructed illusion of European military supremacy in the East. Among those brutally sacrificed on the altar of staggering imperial arrogance were 15,000 incredibly brave men of the 8th Australian Division. These magnificent soldiers were ruthlessly marched straight into the unimaginable nightmare of Japanese prisoner of war camps, completely betrayed by the very commanders who had sworn on their honor to lead them to victory. Countless young men from this completely doomed formation would never see their beautiful, sun-drenched homeland again, tragically wasting away from forced labor, severe malnutrition, and horrifyingly systematic cruelty. The absolutely barbaric conditions along the infamous jungle railways claimed the bright futures of thousands, transforming healthy, vibrant young patriots into broken, traumatized shadows of their former selves. They did not lose their precious freedom in a fair and equal battle, but were casually traded away by high-ranking officials who completely failed to prepare adequate northern coastal defenses. But this catastrophic military collapse in the steaming, oppressive jungles of Malaya was merely the opening act of a much more sinister, deeply shocking political betrayal. When the horrifying news of the Singapore surrender finally reached the quiet corridors of power in Canberra, Australian Prime Minister John Curtin practically aged a full decade overnight. The strategic reality facing his incredibly vulnerable nation was absolutely terrifying, with an aggressively expanding enemy sweeping rapidly southward toward an entirely unprotected massive coastline. While the terrifying dark shadow of an imminent invasion loomed heavily over panic-stricken Australian cities, the absolute best and most experienced divisions of the National Army were still stranded thousands of miles away in the Middle East. They were actively bleeding into the hot, unforgiving desert sands merely to protect British colonial interests, while their own beloved families back home were left completely exposed to a ruthless, unstoppable empire. Curtin realized with sickening, crystal-clear clarity that if he did not take immediate, drastically unprecedented action, the entire Australian continent would face a monumental national tragedy. desperate to save his beloved homeland from absolute fiery ruin, the frantic prime minister began firing off a continuous series of highly urgent cables directly to Winston Churchill in London. Curtin demanded the immediate and unconditional return of the seasoned Australian divisions, passionately insisting that the defense of their own homes must finally take absolute precedence over completely foreign campaigns. However, the responses emanating from the comfortable, heavily fortified bunkers of Whitehall were astonishingly evasive, deeply patronizing, and dripping with an unbelievable level of imperial selfishness. Churchill arrogantly insisted that the Middle Eastern theater remained the supreme, unquestionable priority, casually suggesting that the defense of the Australian mainland could somehow be managed with whatever meager, second-rate resources were left behind. Can you possibly imagine the staggering, breathtaking audacity of a leader demanding that another sovereign nation sacrifice its own very survival merely to protect British commercial access to the Suez Canal? Yet this sickening display of diplomatic arrogance was just a minor preview of the explosive geopolitical earthquake that was about to rock the entire Allied coalition to its core. Pushed to the absolute razor-thin brink by London's blatant, unapologetic disregard for Australian survival, John Curtin made a sensational, historically unprecedented public declaration in December 1941 in a bold move that sent absolute paralyzing shockwaves through the global press. The Prime Minister announced to the entire world that Australia was officially turning its desperate gaze toward the United States of America for salvation. He fearlessly declared that his independent nation was doing so completely free of any pangs about their traditional, deeply historical links with the United Kingdom. This was an incredibly sharp, deeply public, stinging slap directly across the face of the incredibly pompous British establishment, effectively signaling the violent, sudden end of unconditional colonial obedience. Curtin brilliantly and ruthlessly exposed the cold, harsh truth that the grand romantic imperial family was nothing more than a highly convenient myth designed entirely to exploit colonial resources and manpower. The global reaction to this stunning diplomatic pivot was absolutely electrifying, completely throwing the deeply embarrassed British War Cabinet into a state of frantic, uncoordinated panic. Infuriated by this monumental, highly visible public humiliation, the completely humiliated British leadership was eventually forced to formally authorize the repatriation of the highly prized, irreplaceable veteran troops. The massive lumbering transport ships, packed tightly with the battle-hardened, fiercely loyal soldiers of the 7th Division, finally weighed anchor and began the incredibly long and dangerous maritime voyage back toward the Pacific. The exhausted, deeply homesick men standing eagerly on those crowded, rust-streaked decks firmly believed they were finally heading back to defend their own vulnerable families, their beloved cities, and their sovereign territory. They felt a profound, overwhelming sense of righteous duty, completely unaware that a shocking top-secret conspiracy was currently being hatched in the dark, smoke-filled rooms of the British military headquarters. But the incredibly brave men on those vulnerable ships could never have anticipated the jaw-dropping level of treachery that was quietly waiting for them in the treacherous, unforgiving waters of the Indian Ocean. In February 1942, while the heavily laden troop ships were steaming swiftly across the open sea, Winston Churchill issued an absolutely scandalous, highly classified directive that completely defies all rational belief. Without seeking a single solitary shred of permission from the democratically elected Australian government, the British Prime Minister unilaterally ordered the entire maritime convoy to abruptly change its established course and head directly into the raging inferno of Burma. The unbelievable, entirely selfish, wildly arrogant goal of this secret naval diversion was to throw Australian bodies directly into the path of the terrifying Japanese advance, merely to protect the highly lucrative British colonial possessions in India. Churchill treated these fiercely independent, proudly freeborn citizens exactly like mindless wooden pawns on his personal geopolitical chessboard, completely ignoring their fundamental, undeniable right to defend their own homeland. It was an act of supreme diplomatic treachery, a breathtaking, calculated violation of trust that conclusively proved colonial lives meant absolutely nothing to the highly aristocratic, deeply cynical elite. When the deeply alarming, highly classified intelligence regarding this unauthorized maritime diversion finally reached the furious desk of John Curtin, an apocalyptic political firestorm immediately erupted across the continent. The fiercely patriotic Australian leader exploded into an entirely justified, absolutely monumental rage, fully realizing the horrifying extent of the deceit practiced by his supposed senior partners in the Grand Alliance. He immediately unleashed a ferocious, unprecedented barrage of highly classified, blistering telegrams directly toward London, furiously demanding that the stolen ships be turned around that very instant. Curtin completely and utterly abandoned the polite, gentle, highly restrictive language of traditional international diplomacy, issuing a massive, uncompromising ultimatum that threatened to permanently sever the fundamental political relationship between the two allied nations. He made it abundantly, aggressively crystal clear that if Churchill continued this outrageous, illegal hijacking of sovereign military forces, the alliance would suffer a catastrophic and highly public, totally irreversible collapse. However, this unprecedented, high-stakes screaming match across the oceans was merely the final, agonizing death rattle of a deeply toxic and fundamentally broken imperial relationship. Faced with the very real, terrifyingly catastrophic prospect of losing his most reliable, highly effective dominion in the absolute middle of a global catastrophe, a deeply frustrated Churchill was humiliatingly forced to back down. Gnashing his teeth and undoubtedly cursing the sudden, unyielding spine displayed by the fiercely independent colonial leadership, the British Prime Minister reluctantly rescinded his outrageous, highly controversial order and allowed the convoy to resume its journey homeward. The massive ships finally, thankfully, returned to safe Australian waters, but the incredible diplomatic damage inflicted by the scandalous Burma incident was permanent, profound, and utterly impossible to ever repair. The romantic, highly publicized, beautifully painted illusion of free men standing shoulder to shoulder in a beautifully shared democratic cause was instantly incinerated by the cold, calculating, deeply ruthless reality of British imperial supremacy. Every single citizen in Australia suddenly woke up to the chilling, undeniably horrific realization that the wealthy men in London would gladly watch the entire continent burn to ashes if it meant saving a single profitable British outpost. The emotional and psychological toll of this breathtaking, monumental betrayal was magnified 100-fold by the immense rivers of blood that had already been spilled across 3 different highly contested continents. Countless weeping, deeply traumatized families across the nation had already suffered the tragic, permanent loss of their brave sons in the catastrophic, entirely avoidable failures of Greece, the chaotic evacuation of Crete, and the absolute humiliation of Singapore. The fiercely loyal Australian people had paid the ultimate, devastatingly heavy price for their unwavering loyalty to the glorious crown, only to be treated like cheap disposable assets when their own survival was hanging by a terrifyingly thin thread. This explosive, incredibly bitter political showdown over the diverted troop ships forever altered the fundamental core identity of the nation, completely and permanently erasing the naive, highly subservient colonial mindset of previous, entirely trusting generations. From that explosive, deeply defining moment onward, the incredible soldiers of Australia fought with exactly the same magnificent, terrifying fury, but they did so fully knowing they could truly rely on absolutely no one but themselves. The scandalous, completely unforgivable cultural chasm between the incredibly brave frontline heroes and the highly polished aristocrats of the British military establishment was an absolute disgrace that openly defied all rational common sense. While the entire free world burned under the terrifying threat of global tyranny, pompous officers straight out of the highly prestigious Sandhurst Military Academy were genuinely horrified by a simple lack of crisp, robotic salutes, They looked down their patrician noses at the rugged, incredibly battle-hardened Australian troops and audaciously branded these magnificent fighters as completely undisciplined rabble and literal scarecrows. These aristocratic, hopelessly out-of-touch commanders, absolutely obsessed with the mirror-like shine of their expensive leather boots, completely and utterly failed to understand the brutal, blood-soaked reality of modern desert warfare. They foolishly measured true military competence by the precise, tailored angle of a uniform collar, entirely ignoring the undeniable fact that these very same rugged men were actively saving the entire Middle Eastern theater from total catastrophic collapse. The breathtaking irony of this deeply snobbish, incredibly toxic imperial contempt became glaringly, humiliatingly obvious during the darkest, most terrifying nights of the endless North African military campaign. Those very same unkempt, supposedly insubordinate scarecrows were routinely and brilliantly slipping silently into the freezing desert darkness to execute the most spectacularly successful tactical raids of the entire global conflict. In one absolutely legendary, highly classified operation, these magnificent colonial troops successfully infiltrated a heavily guarded German supply depot a full 3 kilometers straight behind the heavily fortified enemy lines. They completely destroyed the vital strategic installation and casually strolled back to their own dusty, flea-infested trenches without suffering a single solitary tragedy among their courageous ranks. While the highly decorated British generals were busy writing incredibly angry, pathetic memos about proper military decorum, the fierce Australian fighters were actively dismantling the supposedly unstoppable German war machine piece by bloody piece. This outrageous, mind-boggling disconnect between the immaculate, perfectly manicured parade grounds of London and the gritty, violently contested trenches of Libya fostered an incredibly deeply permanent resentment among the exhausted frontline troops. The pragmatic, brutally efficient Australian soldiers quickly developed a monumental level of sheer, unadulterated disgust for the highly decorated, fundamentally useless upper echelon commanders who treated them with such breathtaking, unapologetic disrespect. The incredibly tough diggers absolutely refused to bend their proud, battle-scarred knees to this ridiculous, completely outdated aristocratic system, choosing instead to creatively invent their own highly derogatory nickname for the deeply arrogant imperial officers. They universally began referring to the incredibly pompous British leadership as the Pommy Brass, a drippingly sarcastic, razor-sharp term that completely stripped away all the unearned majesty and fake prestige of the imperial military hierarchy. It was a spectacular, quiet, and fiercely defiant rebellion of the common working man against an incredibly toxic system of completely unearned privilege and highly dangerous battlefield incompetence. But this deeply entrenched, highly toxic imperial arrogance was merely the first bitter taste of a completely new, even more infuriating brand of foreign hypocrisy that was rapidly approaching. By the chaotic middle of 1942, the global strategic reality had violently shifted, forcing the incredibly exhausted Australian veterans to rapidly rush back to defend their own highly vulnerable shores from an entirely new, terrifying menace. The epic center of the brutal global struggle violently relocated from the scorching, dusty deserts of North Africa straight into the terrifying, malaria-infested jungles of the remote Kokoda Track in New Guinea. The magnificent soldiers who had miraculously survived the catastrophic, utterly horrific blunders of Greece and the relentless, punishing Siege of Tobruk were now violently thrown directly into a suffocating, muddy green hell. And these brave men were entirely unequipped for dense tropical jungle warfare, suffering horribly from terrifying tropical diseases, completely fragile and easily severed supply lines, and facing a fanatically aggressive Japanese military force that seemed absolutely unstoppable. It was an incredibly desperate, utterly terrifying struggle for the very survival of the entire Australian continent, fought in arguably the most punishing, unforgiving geographic terrain anywhere on the face of the entire planet. What makes this monumental, deeply harrowing jungle campaign truly unbelievable is that the incredibly heavy initial shock of the terrifying Japanese onslaught was heroically absorbed by the immensely brave 39th Battalion. This was one of the absolutely youngest, most shockingly inexperienced military units ever deployed into major combat, with the astonishing average age of its heroic members sitting at a mere 18 years and 8 months. These literal teenagers wearing rapidly rotting boots and carrying completely outdated heavy rifles somehow miraculously managed to hold the crumbling defensive line against highly experienced, deeply ruthless, battle-hardened shock troops. They did not achieve this spectacular, totally unprecedented military miracle through brilliant strategic planning from their distant superiors, but simply through an absolutely unshakable, deeply ingrained refusal to let their beloved homeland fall into the hands of a ruthless invader. The incredibly harrowing Kokoda campaign rapidly transformed into the absolute defining foundational story of modern Australian resilience, completely replacing the outdated, overly romanticized myths of noble imperial adventure with a gritty story of raw national survival. Yet, even in this absolute terrifying moment of supreme national crisis, the highly toxic ghost of arrogant foreign command returned to viciously haunt the exhausted, bleeding defenders in a shockingly familiar, deeply infuriating way. The immensely theatrical, highly egotistical American General Douglas MacArthur had grandly arrived on the beleaguered continent, swiftly taking supreme, unquestioned command of the entire Allied military apparatus in the heavily contested Southwest Pacific. Sitting comfortably in his incredibly luxurious, perfectly safe headquarters hundreds of miles away from the rotting, disease-ridden jungle, MacArthur began secretly penning absolutely scandalous, highly insulting reports directly to his political masters in Washington. He outrageously and falsely claimed that the incredibly brave Australian troops, who were currently enduring horrific, deeply devastating casualties in the suffocating mud, were somehow insufficiently aggressive and completely lacked the proper offensive spirit. The jaw-dropping, monumental hypocrisy of an American general safely hiding in a comfortable, air-conditioned office while simultaneously insulting the brave teenagers actively bleeding to save his fragile reputation was a truly sickening, absolutely unforgettable spectacle. However, the ultimate undeniable reckoning for all these scandalous, deeply buried betrayals was quietly waiting to explode out of the dusty, heavily guarded archives of the post-war world. When the horrific, globe-spanning conflict finally, thankfully concluded, the incredibly tight lid of strict wartime censorship was violently ripped off, finally exposing the breathtaking scale of the terrifying incompetence and calculated imperial betrayal. Official, highly classified post-war inquiries into the disastrous Mediterranean campaigns conclusively and undeniably proved that British military planners had deliberately and knowingly sent elite Australian units into completely unwinnable, hopelessly doomed situations. Even more incredibly, the deeply personal, highly guarded wartime diaries of the brilliant German commander Erwin Rommel were finally published, completely destroying the false, highly arrogant British narrative regarding the capability of colonial troops. The legendary Axis general explicitly wrote that the magnificent Australian forces had completely halted his terrifying armored advance in ways that his own highly sophisticated command structure had never even thought realistically possible. It was the absolute ultimate vindication for the brave, thoroughly exhausted diggers, a spectacular, undeniable confirmation of their supreme combat brilliance coming directly from the absolute highest ranks of the former enemy command structure. But the completely staggering, heart-wrenching human cost of this astonishing imperial arrogance is a deeply tragic, incredibly heavy burden that absolutely demands to be written out and remembered in full, horrifying detail. More than 39,000 incredibly brave Australian souls were tragically lost forever during the terrifying conflict. A simply monumental, catastrophic demographic blow to a small, incredibly tight-knit nation of fewer than 7 million people. Additionally, an absolutely staggering 22,000 courageous soldiers were brutally forced into the unimaginable, deeply horrific conditions of Japanese prisoner of war camps, enduring a living nightmare that was deliberately, monstrously designed to break the human spirit. Along the infamous blood-soaked tracks of the Burma-Thailand Railway alone, more than 2,200 magnificent Australian men tragically perished in the sweltering heat, completely abandoned by the massive empire they had so loyally served. These are not just sterile, easily forgotten historical statistics. They represent endless rivers of bitter tears, entire generations of completely broken families, and an incredibly heavy, permanent psychological scar on the very soul of the southern continent. The immense, totally crushing weight of this unbelievable national trauma ultimately claimed the life of the very man who had fought so desperately to protect his incredibly vulnerable people from arrogant foreign interference. The fiercely patriotic Prime Minister John Curtin, whose physical health was completely and utterly destroyed by the impossible, agonizing pressure of constantly battling the treacherous political maneuvers of Winston Churchill, tragically passed away at the age of 60. He took his final, incredibly tired breath in July 1945, just mere weeks before the ultimate, long-awaited surrender of the Japanese Empire, forever missing the incredibly hard-won peace he had sacrificed absolutely everything to secure. The deeply grieving nation profoundly mourned not just the tragic loss of an incredibly brave, fiercely independent political leader, but the absolute final end of an entirely trusting era of naive, childlike obedience to a distant, incredibly uncaring crown. Curtin instantly became the ultimate political martyr of a deeply broken, highly toxic alliance, a powerful, unifying symbol of a young nation that was finally, painfully learning to stand proudly and firmly on its own 2 feet, and from the smoldering, blood-soaked ashes of the spectacular imperial betrayal, a completely new, fiercely independent national identity was about to aggressively forge itself in the fires of hard-won truth. The incredibly toxic, unspoken policy of the British High Command was finally dragged kicking and screaming into the blinding, unforgiving light of day for the entire free world to witness in sheer, unadulterated horror. The incredibly callous phrase, "send the Australians first," was never actually officially printed on any formal, stamped military order, but it was the absolute, undeniable, cold-blooded operational logic of a deeply prejudiced and highly calculating imperial system. It was a spectacularly cynical, completely ruthless philosophy that quietly dictated that colonial lives were entirely expendable, acting merely as cheap foreign currency to be casually spent in the endless, desperate pursuit of protecting British global power and prestige. The incredibly brave soldiers who miraculously managed to survive the burning, explosive deserts, the rotting, terrifying jungles, and the horrific, starvation-filled prisoner camps returned to their beautiful homeland carrying a deeply, profound, totally unshakable new conviction. They stepped off those rusty, completely exhausted transport ships, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that they could never, ever again blindly entrust their precious, completely irreplaceable lives to the selfish, entirely unpredictable whims of any arrogant foreign empire. This monumental, incredibly painful psychological realization did not manifest as a loud, chaotic, violent revolution in the city streets, but rather as a quiet, deeply profound, and entirely irreversible shift in the collective national psychology. The legendary, highly respected Rats of Tobruk, the muddy, fiercely determined heroes of the Kokoda track, and the deeply traumatized, incredibly resilient survivors of the jungle camps became the silent, absolutely unbreakable foundation of a completely transformed modern society. They had obediently and bravely marched into the absolute worst, most terrifying meat grinders the world had ever seen, armed with the absolute least amount of support, fighting for highly questionable strategic objectives that almost entirely served foreign political interests. They had repeatedly performed absolutely unimaginable, breathtaking military miracles under the most horrifying, entirely disadvantageous conditions imaginable. completely shattering the pompous, highly arrogant, completely unearned myths of the traditional European military aristocracy. And the entire magnificent continent of Australia was forever fundamentally changed by their incredible, heartbreaking sacrifice, permanently forging an incredibly fierce, proudly independent national spirit that continues to boldly and loudly define the magnificent country to this very day.